He came home early, flowers in hand, excited to surprise his wife for their anniversary. But what he walked in shattered his world. A man, a betrayal, and a moment of heartbreak that left him stunned. As emotions ran high, the cops were called, walking in on a scene no one could have expected. But what this heartbroken husband did next wasn't what anyone could have imagined. Forgiveness, secrets, and a life-changing decision that will leave you questioning everything. How do you rebuild a life when it's been ripped apart? And how does one act of kindness change everything forever? Stay tuned for a story of heartbreak, redemption, and the power of love to heal even the deepest wounds. Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. Michael Carter settled into his favorite rocking chair on the front porch, the morning sun warming his weathered face. The familiar creak of wood beneath him matched the rhythm of his thoughts as he gazed across the well-kept lawn of his suburban home. After 35 years of running into burning buildings and saving lives, the quiet Monday morning felt like a gift, a stark contrast to the adrenaline-fueled decades that had defined his life. His calloused fingers traced the arm of the chair, worn smooth from years of use. The neighborhood was peaceful, just the distant sound of kids waiting for the school bus and the gentle rustle of spring leaves in the breeze. A few houses down, Mrs. Henderson waved as she collected her morning paper. It was so different from the blaring sirens and controlled chaos that had defined his career, where every second could mean the difference between life and death. 25 years, he whispered to himself, a smile tugging at his lips. Next week's anniversary felt like more than just a milestone. It was the beginning of something new. He and Sharon could finally have the time together they'd always talked about, those precious moments they'd sacrificed for his demanding career. The thought of his wife made his heart warm, despite the distance that had grown between them lately. Michael understood that his long hours and irregular schedule had taken their toll, but retirement would change all that. He'd make up for lost time, rebuild the closeness they once shared. He stood up, energized by his plans for the day, his joints creaking in protest. Inside, he grabbed his car keys and wallet from the ceramic bowl Sharon had made in her pottery class years ago. The familiar weight of his wedding ring caught the morning light as he reached for his jacket, reminding him of the day Sharon had slipped it onto his finger. Her eyes had sparkled with tears of joy back then, her hands trembling with emotion. The drive to Robinson's Jewelry was filled with memories that played like a familiar movie in his mind. He remembered their first apartment, barely big enough for two, but filled with so much love and laughter. The birth of their children, Sharon's hand gripping his through each delivery, her face glowing with exhausted joy. The proud smile on her face at his promotion ceremony when she'd pinned the badge on his uniform with shaking fingers. "Can I help you find something special?" the jewelry store clerk asked, her name tag reading, Sarah. Michael nodded, his eyes crinkling with warmth. "It's our 25th anniversary next week." He pointed to a delicate silver necklace with a heart-shaped pendant, small diamonds catching the light. "That one. It's perfect." After securing dinner reservations at La Maison, their favorite restaurant since their first dating days, Michael stopped at Peterson's florist. The sweet scent of roses filled his nose as he selected a bouquet of Sharon's favorites. Pink roses mixed with white lilies, their petals soft as silk against his rough hands. Driving home earlier than usual, Michael couldn't stop smiling. The small velvet box sat on the passenger seat beside the flowers, holding promises of renewed connection. He thought about how Sharon's face would light up when he surprised her with dinner plans, imagining the sparkle returning to her eyes. Pulling into the driveway, Michael gathered his precious cargo. The house looked exactly as he'd left it that morning, but something felt different. Maybe it was the anticipation making his heart beat faster, or perhaps it was something else, a subtle shift in the air he couldn't quite name. "Sharon?" he called out as he stepped through the front door. The house answered with silence, but then a sound. Laughter, muffled but distinct, drifted down from upstairs, foreign and jarring in the quiet house. Michael's brow furrowed. He placed the flowers and gift box on the entryway table, his movement suddenly slow and uncertain. Each step up the stairs seemed to echo in his chest, matching his heartbeat. The laughter came again, followed by a man's voice he didn't recognize, intimate and casual in a way that made his stomach clench. His hand trembled slightly as he reached for the bedroom doorknob, the metal cool against his palm. The door swung open, and Michael's world stopped turning, the moment stretching into an endless nightmare. There was his wife, intimate with another man in their bed, the bed they'd shared for 25 years, where they'd nursed sick children and whispered dreams in the dark. The flowers he'd bought suddenly felt like they were burning his hands, each petal a reminder of his shattered trust. Michael stood frozen in the doorway, unable to move, unable to speak, as his carefully planned future crumbled before his eyes. The weight of 3 decades of memories pressed down on him like a physical force, threatening to bring him to his knees. The bedroom fell into a suffocating silence as Michael stood frozen in the doorway, his anniversary gift slipping from numb fingers. The small velvet box hit the carpet with a soft thud that seemed to echo through the room like a gunshot in the dark. Sharon clutched the bedsheet to her chest, her face draining of color as she stared at her husband of nearly 25 years. Her fingers twisted the expensive Egyptian cotton that they'd bought together last spring. "Michael!" Sharon's voice cracked like thin ice. It's not what it looks like." Her words hung in the air, as hollow as the promises she'd made on their wedding day. The words hit Michael like a physical blow, making him stumble back half a step. His hands began to shake uncontrollably, and the beautiful bouquet of roses he'd been holding dropped to the floor, scattering crimson petals across the threshold like drops of blood. "Not what it looks like?" Michael's voice was barely above a whisper, but it carried the weight of a thunderstorm. His chest felt tight, like during a house fire when the smoke gets too thick. "Because it looks like my wife is in our bed with another man." Greg Dawson, still shirtless, reached for his clothes with practiced casualness that made Michael's blood boil. His movements were too smooth, too rehearsed. "Listen, man, let's all just calm down." "Don't you dare tell me to calm down!" Michael's shout made both Sharon and Greg flinch, the sound bouncing off the walls of their master bedroom. "In my house! In my bed!" Each word came out harder than the last, decades of trust crumbling with every syllable, like a building collapsing in on itself. Greg moved toward the door, pulling on his shirt with quick, nervous movements. "I should go." Michael planted himself firmly in the doorway, his firefighter's build blocking any escape route. 35 years of carrying gear and saving lives had left him solid as oak. "You're not going anywhere." He pulled out his phone with trembling fingers, nearly dropping it twice. "Michael, please," Sharon pleaded, tears streaming down her face, leaving trails in her usually perfect makeup. "Don't do anything rash." "Rash?" Michael barked out a bitter laugh as he dialed 911. The sound was like broken glass. "Like sleeping with another man in our marriage bed?" 911, what's your emergency? "Yes, I need to report an intruder in my home," Michael said, his eyes never leaving Greg's face, watching the younger man's confident facade begin to crack. 4287 Maple Street. "Michael, stop this!" Sharon scrambled from the bed, still wrapped in the sheet, stumbling as the fabric tangled around her legs. "Greg isn't an intruder." "The police are on their way," Michael informed them, his voice cold and controlled, despite the tremors running through his body. The calmness in his tone came from years of handling emergencies, though none had ever cut this deep. "I suggest you both stay right where you are." Greg's casual demeanor finally cracked like a cheap mask. "Come on, man, this is ridiculous. Just let me leave, and we can all forget this happened." "Forget?" Michael's laugh was hollow, echoing off the walls like a ghost. Like Sharon forgot her wedding vows? The distant wail of police sirens cut through the tension, growing louder with each passing second. Michael's jaw clenched until his teeth ached as he looked at Sharon one last time. The woman before him bore little resemblance to the bride who had promised to love him forever, standing under an arch of white roses that matched the ones now scattered at his feet. Without another word, he turned and headed downstairs to meet the police, leaving behind the scattered roses that now seemed like a cruel joke, their sweet perfume mixing with the bitter taste of betrayal. 2 police officers approached the front door cautiously, hands hovering near their holstered weapons. The taller officer, his badge glinting in the porch light, knocked firmly 3 times. "Police!" Anyone home?" Michael opened the door, his face etched with exhaustion and grief. His normally pressed shirt was wrinkled, testament to the chaos of the evening. "I'm the one who called. Please come in." The officers followed Michael up the stairs, their boots heavy on the worn wooden steps. Each creak seemed to echo through the silent house. Sharon had managed to get dressed in a wrinkled blouse and pants, though her hair was still disheveled and her makeup smeared. Greg stood awkwardly in the corner of the bedroom, hands shoved in his pockets, looking anywhere but at Michael or the officers. "Sir," the female officer spoke first, her voice professional but gentle, her dark eyes assessing the situation. "You reported an intruder?" Michael gestured toward Greg, his voice surprisingly steady despite the slight tremor in his hands. "This is the man I caught in bed with my wife about 20 minutes ago." The officers exchanged knowing glances, their postures relaxing slightly as they realized the nature of the situation. The male officer holstered his weapon with a practiced motion and pulled out a small notepad from his breast pocket. Sharon stepped forward, her hands twisting together nervously, her wedding ring catching the light. "Officers, I need to be honest. Greg isn't an intruder, he's—" She swallowed hard, tears welling in her eyes and threatening to spill over. "He's been my lover for the past 3 years." The admission hung heavy in the air like a thundercloud about to break. Michael closed his eyes, his jaw clenching as he absorbed the blow of hearing it stated so plainly. When he opened them again, something had shifted in his expression, a mixture of profound sadness and unexpected clarity. "I forgive you, Sharon," he said quietly, stunning everyone in the room. His words carried the weight of decades of shared history. "But I can't stay here." The female officer blinked in surprise, while her partner's pen stopped moving across his notepad. Sharon's mouth fell open, but no words came out, her face a mask of disbelief. "Sir," the male officer said softly, stepping closer to Michael, genuine respect in his voice. "You're stronger than most. Not many can handle betrayal like that." Michael nodded tiredly, the lines around his eyes deepening. "Thank you for coming. Would you mind escorting him out? For everyone's safety?" "Of course," the female officer replied, gesturing for Greg to follow her. "Sir, please come with us." As Greg was led downstairs, Michael moved through the bedroom with deliberate calmness, gathering some clothes and basic necessities into an overnight bag. His hands moved automatically, selecting items he'd need for the next few days. Sharon stood frozen, watching him pack, tears streaming down her face, leaving dark tracks on her cheeks. The male officer supervised the scene until Michael was ready to leave. Without another word, Michael walked out of the bedroom, down the stairs, and out to his car. The drive to the nearest motel passed in a blur of streetlights and empty roads. In the stark motel room with its generic artwork and faint smell of cleaning supplies, Michael sat heavily on the edge of the bed. The reality of everything finally crashed over him like a tidal wave, and he buried his face in his hands, his broad shoulders shaking with silent sobs as 25 years of marriage crumbled around him like a house of cards. Sunlight filtered through thin motel curtains, casting unfamiliar shadows across Michael's face. He blinked slowly, taking in the dated wallpaper and generic artwork above the bed. The room smelled of stale cigarettes and cheap air freshener. For a moment, confusion clouded his mind. This wasn't his bedroom. Then his eyes landed on his left hand, the gold wedding band catching the morning light, and yesterday's events crashed over him like a tidal wave. "Sharon," he whispered, his voice rough from a night of restless sleep. The image of her with Greg flashed through his mind, making his stomach turn. Their intimate embrace in the kitchen, the look of shock on Sharon's face when she realized he'd come home early. It all played on repeat in his thoughts. He sat up slowly, his body feeling decades older than just yesterday morning. His phone buzzed again, the screen showing 15 missed calls and twice as many text messages from Sharon. Each notification felt like another small betrayal. Michael turned the phone face down on the nightstand, unable to deal with her explanations or excuses. The weight of 25 years of marriage seemed to press down on his chest. Later, he found himself walking downtown, his feet carrying him with no real destination in mind. The same streets he'd known for decades somehow felt different now, as if the lens through which he viewed the world had cracked. Every familiar storefront held memories he wasn't ready to face. The bell above the door of Joe's Diner chimed as Michael stepped inside. The familiar smell of coffee and bacon that usually brought comfort now just made his stomach clench. The vinyl booth seats squeaked as regular customers shifted to look at him. "Coffee, black," he told the young waitress who approached with a menu. Her name tag read Jenny, and she couldn't have been more than 20. She studied his face with concern, tucking a strand of brown hair behind her ear. "Are you sure that's all? You look like you could use some breakfast." Michael shook his head, forcing a weak smile. "Just coffee, thanks." "Everything okay, sir?" She pressed gently, her young face showing genuine worry. "Fine," he replied shortly, turning to stare out the window. The word tasted bitter in his mouth. The coffee sat mostly untouched as he watched people pass by outside, steam slowly fading from the cup. His wedding ring felt heavy, like it was weighing his whole hand down. Every now and then he caught himself twisting it around his finger, a nervous habit of 25 years that now felt like a reminder of everything he'd lost. The local park was filled with weekend visitors, their carefree laughter a stark contrast to the heaviness in his chest. A young couple walked hand in hand, sharing secret smiles. A father pushed his daughter on the swings, her delighted squeals carrying across the grass. Each scene was like a knife to Michael's heart, reminding him of all the plans he'd made for his retirement, plans that had always included Sharon. The future they'd talked about seemed to dissolve like morning mist. Back in his motel room, Michael sat in the worn armchair by the window, the fabric rough against his arms. The street outside had grown quiet as evening settled in. Traffic lights changed from red to green and back again, their reflection making his wedding ring glint in the darkness. A car horn honked in the distance, and somewhere, a dog barked. "What now?" he whispered to the empty room, his voice barely audible. The question hung in the air unanswered as night fell over the unfamiliar room that now held his broken dreams. The soft hum of the air conditioner was his only reply. Michael's eyes opened to the harsh glare of his phone screen lighting up for what felt like the 100th time. Sharon's name flashed across the display again, along with a preview of yet another message begging him to talk. Without hesitation, he deleted the notifications, each tap of his finger feeling like a tiny act of self-preservation. "Enough," he muttered, pushing himself out of bed. The motel room felt smaller this morning, its walls closing in with memories he wasn't ready to face. The morning air felt crisp against his face as he walked through town, letting his feet guide him wherever they wanted to go. Before he knew it, he found himself standing in front of the Copper Kettle, an old bar he hadn't visited in years. The worn wooden sign creaked gently in the breeze, almost like it was welcoming him back. Inside, the bar looked exactly as he remembered. Dark wood panels, soft lighting, and the familiar scent of beer and decades-old stories. He settled onto a bar stool, ordering a drink he didn't really want but needed to justify his presence. "Michael Carter, is that really you?" The voice cut through his thoughts like a warm knife through butter. He turned to find Laura Mitchell smiling at him, her gray-streaked hair pulled back in a neat ponytail. She looked older than when he'd last seen her, but her eyes still held that same kindness he remembered from their days working together. "Laura," he said, managing a genuine smile for the first time in days. "It's been what? 6 years?" "At least," she replied, settling onto the stool next to him. "I'm working part-time at Memorial now, just enough to keep Jacob in soccer cleats and video games." She chuckled softly, but Michael caught the hint of weariness in her voice. "How old is Jacob now?" 15 going on 30, Laura said, shaking her head. "It's been challenging, especially since Tom passed. 5 years next month, if you can believe it." Michael nodded sympathetically, remembering when he'd heard about Tom's overdose. "You're doing a great job, Laura. Always have." "Some days are better than others," she admitted, stirring her coffee. "But we keep moving forward, right? How about you? I heard you finally retired." "Yeah, just recently," Michael said, grateful for the simple question. still trying to figure out what's next. Laura seemed to sense his hesitation and didn't push further. Instead, she pulled out her phone. "Here, take my number. Sometimes it helps just to have someone to talk to who understands what it's like when life throws you curveballs." Michael accepted her offer, programming the number into his phone. For the first time since leaving his house, he felt a small spark of hope. Not for any particular reason, just the simple comfort of knowing he wasn't completely alone. Sunlight streamed through the thin motel curtains as Michael stirred awake. For the first time since discovering Sharon's betrayal, his mind wasn't immediately flooded with painful images. Instead, he found himself thinking about Laura and their conversation from the night before. He remembered working countless emergency calls with her, the way she always kept her cool under pressure. There was that terrible apartment fire in '98, where her quick thinking had saved 2 children. Even when things got rough, Laura maintained that steady presence that made everyone around her feel safer. Michael sat up in bed, reaching for his phone. This time, instead of deleting messages, he scrolled through his contacts until he found Laura's number. His thumb hovered over it for a moment before he pressed call. "Hello?" Laura's warm voice answered on the 3rd ring. "Laura, it's Michael. I was wondering if you'd like to grab coffee this afternoon." They met at a small cafe downtown, away from their usual haunts. Laura was already there when he arrived, 2 steaming mugs on the table in front of her. "I remembered you take it black," she said with a gentle smile. As they settled in, Laura shared more about her life. "You know, losing Tom wasn't just about his death," she admitted, stirring her coffee absently. "The addiction took him long before that. Watching someone you love slowly disappear, it changes you." Michael nodded, understanding the weight of her words. "But Jacob keeps me going," she continued, her eyes brightening at the mention of her son. "The hospital work helps too. Gives me purpose, you know." Michael found himself opening up in return. "I had all these plans for retirement," he said, his voice catching slightly. "Sharon and I were supposed to travel, spend more time with the kids. Funny how things don't work out like you expect." Laura didn't push for details, didn't try to fill the silence that followed. Instead, she reached across the table and briefly squeezed his hand. "Sometimes we need to let ourselves feel lost before we can find our way again." As they prepared to leave, Laura turned to him. "I'm really glad we ran into each other, Michael. And I meant what I said. I'm here if you need someone to talk to." "Thank you, Laura," Michael replied, feeling a small flutter of hope in his chest for the first time in days. "That means more than you know." Michael walked through the quiet streets of his hometown, the morning sun warming his shoulders. His conversation with Laura from the day before had stirred something in him. A glimmer of hope, maybe. Or at least the courage to face what he'd been avoiding for too long. He pulled out his phone and stared at Megan's contact photo. It was from years ago, showing her bright smile at her college graduation. His thumb trembled slightly as he pressed call. The phone rang several times before going to voicemail. "Hi, sweetie, it's Dad," he said, trying to keep his voice steady. "I know it's been a while and, well, I miss you. I'd really like to talk when you have a chance. Nothing's wrong, I'd like to hear your voice." He paused, swallowing hard. "Love you, Meg." Next, he tried James. The call went straight to voicemail, making Michael's heart sink a little deeper. He'd expected this, but it still hurt. After the beep, he cleared his throat. "Hey, buddy, it's your old man. Been thinking about you a lot lately. Give me a call when you can, okay?" Sitting down on a park bench, Michael typed out 2 careful messages. To Megan, "I know things haven't been great between us, but I want to change that. You're my daughter and I love you. Can we talk?" To James, "Son, I miss you. I know I wasn't always there the way I should have been. I'd like a chance to make things right." Throughout the day, Michael kept checking his phone. Each time the screen remained blank, the weight in his chest grew heavier. He watched young families in the park, fathers pushing their kids on swings, mothers reading stories on picnic blankets. A teenage girl hugged her dad after he brought her an ice cream cone. The scene before him felt like a cruel reminder of everything he'd lost. Not just Sharon's betrayal, but the slow dissolution of his family over the years. When had they stopped having Sunday dinners together? When was the last time James had called him just to chat about sports? Why couldn't he remember the last real conversation he'd had with Megan? He sat there until the afternoon shadows grew long, occasionally glancing at his silent phone. Each passing hour made him feel more like a stranger in his own life, disconnected from the very people who once gave his world meaning. Back in his motel room that evening, Michael gave his phone one final check. No missed calls, no text messages, no responses from either of his children. With a heavy sigh, he placed the phone on the nightstand and turned away from it, the silence of the room echoing his isolation. Michael stirred his black coffee absently, watching the steam rise in the quiet motel breakfast area. The plastic chair squeaked as he shifted, trying to find comfort in the uncomfortable furniture. A few other guests shuffled around, grabbing their continental breakfast, but he barely noticed them. His phone buzzed against the table, making him jump. Sharon's name lit up the screen. His heart thumped harder as he stared at it, his finger hovering over the red decline button. After 4 rings, he surprised himself by answering. "Hello?" His voice came out rougher than he intended. "Michael?" Sharon's voice trembled slightly. "I need to see you. Please." He closed his eyes, pinching the bridge of his nose. "Sharon, I don't think—" "It's important," she cut in. "The Coffee Bean on Main Street. Just give me 15 minutes. That's all I'm asking." Something in her tone made him pause. After a long moment, he sighed. "Fine. Half an hour." The cafe was quiet when he arrived, with only a few customers scattered around. Sharon sat in a corner booth, her hands wrapped around an untouched cup of tea. She looked different somehow, smaller, paler. Her usually perfect makeup couldn't quite hide the dark circles under her eyes. "Thank you for coming," she said as he slid into the seat across from her. Michael didn't respond, just waited. The silence stretched between them like a physical thing. Sharon's fingers tightened around her cup. "I went to the doctor last week," she started, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'd been having some symptoms and—" She took a shaky breath. "It's cancer, Michael. Stage 4. They're giving me maybe 6 months." The words hit him like a physical blow. He stared at her, trying to process what she'd said, but his mind seemed to have gone blank. "I'm not telling you this to get your sympathy," she continued quickly, "and I'm not asking for forgiveness. I know what I did, what I've done to our family." Her voice cracked. "But Megan and James, I can't leave things like this with them. I need your help to make things right before—" She couldn't finish the sentence. Michael sat frozen, his coffee going cold in front of him. The woman he'd loved for 25 years, the same woman who'd betrayed him so completely just days ago, was now telling him she was dying. The anger he'd been nursing suddenly felt hollow in the face of this new reality. When he finally stood up, his legs felt unsteady. Without a word, he walked out of the cafe and to his truck. Sitting behind the wheel, he stared blankly at the dashboard, his mind a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. The key hung untouched in the ignition as he tried to make sense of how everything had changed yet again in the span of 15 minutes. Michael sat on the edge of the motel bed, his phone heavy in his hands. The morning sun filtered through thin curtains, casting shadows across the worn carpet. Sharon's words from yesterday echoed in his mind. Cancer, 6 months, making things right. He opened his messaging app, staring at his children's names. The last text to Megan was from 3 months ago, just a brief happy birthday. With James, it had been even longer. His thumbs hovered over the keyboard as he tried to find the right words. "How do you tell your kids their mother is dying?" he muttered to himself, running a hand through his gray hair. After several attempts, he typed out a simple message. "Megan, James, I need to talk to you both about something important. Could we meet for coffee this week? Just us. Please." His finger trembled slightly as he hit send. The message showed as delivered, but remained unread. Feeling suffocated by the small room, Michael grabbed his truck keys. He needed space to think, to breathe. The familiar rumble of his old Ford pickup offered some comfort as he pulled onto the highway, no destination in mind. As he drove past familiar neighborhoods and strip malls, memories flooded back. Teaching James to ride a bike, watching Megan's soccer games, family dinners that grew increasingly quiet as the years went by. When had they started drifting apart? Had he been so focused on work, on providing for them, that he'd missed the signs? His phone chimed from the passenger seat. At a red light, he glanced over. It was Megan. "Okay, Dad. Thursday afternoon? The coffee shop near your old station?" Relief washed over him, followed quickly by anxiety about James's continued silence. The light turned green, and Michael drove on, his mind churning with thoughts of what he'd say to Megan, how he'd explain everything that had happened. After 2 hours of aimless driving, Michael returned to the motel parking lot. He sat in his truck, checking his phone one more time. Megan's message gave him a glimmer of hope, but James's name stayed stubbornly silent in his message thread. The weight of what lay ahead, telling his children about their mother's illness, trying to rebuild their broken family, pressed down on his shoulders as he stared at the dimming screen. The morning sun cast long shadows across the parking lot as Michael pulled into the cafe. His conversation with Sharon still weighed heavily on his mind, but the thought of talking to Laura brought a small measure of comfort. He spotted her through the window, already seated at a corner table with 2 steaming cups of coffee. "I ordered your usual," Laura said with a warm smile as he slid into the seat across from her. "Black coffee, right?" "Nah," Michael nodded, wrapping his hands around the warm mug. "Thanks for meeting me on such short notice." Laura's eyes studied his face with gentle concern. "Something's troubling you, Michael. I can tell." He stared into his coffee for a long moment, gathering his thoughts. "Sharon's sick," he finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Terminal cancer. 6 months, maybe less." Laura's hand moved instinctively across the table, resting near his but not quite touching. "Oh, Michael, I'm so sorry." "She wants my help," he continued, his voice rough with emotion. "To reconnect with our kids before—" He couldn't finish the sentence. "That must be incredibly difficult for you," Laura said softly, "especially after everything that's happened." Michael nodded, taking a sip of coffee to steady himself. "I don't know what to do. Part of me is still so angry, but—" "You know," Laura began, her eyes distant with memory, "when Tom was struggling with addiction, he pushed us all away. The emotional walls he built." She paused, collecting herself. "After he passed, I had to learn that forgiveness wasn't about excusing his actions. It was about freeing myself from the weight of that anger." Michael looked up, meeting her understanding gaze. "How did you do it?" "One day at a time," she replied. "And some days were harder than others. There's no rushing through grief or healing, Michael. You have to give yourself permission to feel whatever you're feeling." "I just don't know if I can help her," Michael admitted. "Or if I should." "Maybe start by helping yourself," Laura suggested gently. "The rest will follow when you're ready." As they prepared to leave, Laura stood and placed a reassuring hand on Michael's shoulder. "You're stronger than you think, Michael. Remember that." "Thank you," he replied, managing a small smile. "For everything." The afternoon sun cast harsh shadows across the driveway as Michael parked in front of the house he'd shared with Sharon for over 2 decades. His stomach churned as he walked up the familiar path to the front door, each step feeling heavier than the last. Sharon opened the door before he could knock. Her face was drawn and pale, dark circles under her eyes making her look older than her years. "Thank you for coming," she said softly, stepping aside to let him in. The house felt different now, colder somehow. Michael followed Sharon to the kitchen, where she'd set out 2 cups of tea. They sat across from each other at the small table where they'd shared countless meals together. "My first chemotherapy session is scheduled for next week," Sharon began, her hands fidgeting with her cup. "The doctors say we need to be aggressive with the treatment." Michael nodded, keeping his expression neutral. "How often will the sessions be?" "Twice a week at first." Sharon's voice wavered slightly. "Michael, about everything that happened, Let's focus on the practical matters, he interrupted, not ready to hear what felt like hollow remorse. They discussed treatment schedules and medical arrangements, the conversation staying safely in neutral territory until Sharon brought up their children. I need to make things right with them, she said, her eyes filling with tears. I know I've been distant. Michael felt a flash of anger at her understatement. Distant? You've been absent for years, Sharon. His eyes caught sight of something on her desk in the corner, a stack of envelopes yellowed with age. What are those? Sharon followed his gaze and flushed. Letters, she admitted, to Megan and James. I wrote them over the years, but I couldn't. Michael stood up and walked over to the desk, picking up one of the letters. The paper was soft with age, the address written in Sharon's neat handwriting. You wrote to them but never sent these? His voice rose with frustration. All these years they thought you didn't care enough to reach out, and you had these just sitting here? I was afraid, Sharon whispered. I didn't know how to bridge the gap that kept growing. Michael set the letter down, his hands shaking slightly. Your fear cost us our family, Sharon, not just the affair. All of this. He grabbed his keys from the table, needing to leave before his anger got the better of him. I'll help with the medical appointments, but fixing things with the kids? That's on you. I need to focus on rebuilding my relationship with them, not making excuses for yours. Without waiting for a response, Michael walked out, the screen door closing behind him with a soft click. As he drove away, he could see Sharon standing at the window, looking small and lost in the growing shadows of the house. Michael sat at the small desk in his motel room staring at his phone. The morning light filtered through thin curtains as he carefully typed and deleted messages to his children. Each word felt heavy with meaning. Megan, I know things haven't been great between us, he typed, then paused. I miss you, sweetheart. I'd really like to see you and talk. No pressure, just a father wanting to reconnect with his daughter. For James, he wrote something similar but added, Son, I know you're angry and you have every right to be, but I'd like a chance to listen, to understand. After sending the messages, Michael paced the small room. Hours crawled by with no response. Around 6, a gentle knock at his door broke the silence. Laura stood there with 2 takeout bags from the local diner. Thought you might be hungry, she said with a warm smile, and maybe need some company. Michael felt relief wash over him. Come in. I wasn't planning on eating, but now that you mention it. They sat at the small table sharing meatloaf and mashed potatoes. Laura told funny stories about her son Jacob's latest attempts at cooking, making Michael laugh for the first time in days. As they finished eating, Laura's expression grew serious. You know, Michael, sometimes we carry guilt we don't deserve. Marriage is complicated. It takes 2 people to make it work, or not work. Michael pushed his plate away. I should have seen the signs. Should have done more. You can't take all the blame, Laura said softly. Sometimes we need to forgive ourselves too. His phone buzzed, making them both jump. It was Megan. Dad, okay, tomorrow at 2? The coffee shop on Main? Michael's hands shook slightly as he showed Laura the message. She squeezed his arm gently. That's good news. He quickly replied to Megan, confirming the time. Then he checked again for any word from James. Nothing. One step at a time, Laura reminded him, helping clean up their dinner. Focus on tomorrow with Megan. James will come around when he's ready. After Laura left, Michael lay in bed, his phone on the nightstand. He kept glancing at it, hoping to see a message from his son. Sleep came slowly, filled with worry about James's silence and hope for tomorrow's meeting with Megan. The morning sun cast long shadows across the coffee shop's wooden tables as Michael arrived early, his hands fidgeting with a paper napkin. His heart skipped when he saw Megan walk in, her shoulders tense and her expression guarded. She looked so much like her mother at that age, but carried herself differently, more withdrawn, more cautious. Hi, Dad, she said quietly, sliding into the seat across from him. Thanks for coming, sweetheart. Michael pushed a coffee toward her, Caramel latte, her favorite since college. She glanced at it, but didn't touch it. "So," Megan said, her fingers drumming on the table. "Why now?" Michael tried to ease the tension with a gentle smile. "Remember when you were little and we'd go to the park every Sunday? You'd always beg for one more turn on the swings." "Dad," Megan cut in sharply, her voice tight. "I didn't come here to reminisce." Michael took a deep breath. "You're right, I wanted to see you because I've made mistakes. I wasn't there enough when you needed me. I let things slide with your mother when I should have stood up for you and James." Megan's eyes glistened. "Do you know how many times I needed you? How many times Mom just wasn't there? And you kept acting like everything was fine." "I know," Michael said softly. "I thought keeping the peace would help, but I was wrong. I should have fought harder for you both." "She never came to my college graduation," Megan's voice cracked. "Said she had a headache. Then I saw pictures of her at lunch with her friends that same day on Facebook." Michael reached across the table, but Megan pulled her hands back. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "I failed you both." "You stayed with her," Megan accused, "even when it was obvious she didn't care about any of us. Why?" Michael didn't try to defend himself. "I was wrong. I thought I was doing the right thing by keeping our family together, but I ended up letting you down instead." After a long pause, Michael said gently, "Your mother would like to see you." Megan's face hardened. "Of course she does, now that it's convenient for her." "I know it's asking a lot." "I'll think about it," Megan interrupted. She was quiet for a moment, then added, "But only if James agrees to go too. I'm not facing her alone." She stood up, leaving the untouched coffee on the table. "And Dad? I'm doing this for you, not her." The afternoon sun beat down on Michael as he stood outside James's apartment building, gathering his courage. He'd driven across town after another unanswered call, hoping his son would at least hear him out in person. His knuckles rapped against the door and he heard movement inside. The door opened just enough for James to peer out, his expression hardening when he saw his father. "Dad, what are you doing here?" "James, please, I need to talk to you." Michael's voice was steady, but pleading. After a long moment, James stepped back, opening the door wider. "Fine. Come in." The apartment was neat but sparse, with a few framed photographs on the walls, none of them family pictures, Michael noticed with a pang. James crossed his arms, leaning against the kitchen counter. "I know I've made mistakes," Michael began, but James cut him off. "Mistakes? That's what you're calling it?" James's voice rose. "You watched Mom push us away for years. You saw how she treated us, how distant she was, and you did nothing. You just kept making excuses for her." Michael absorbed the words, letting his son's anger wash over him. James paced the small living room, years of hurt spilling out. "Do you know how many times I needed you both? How many times I watched Megan cry because Mom missed another important event? And you just stood there pretending everything was fine." When James finally ran out of steam, Michael spoke softly. "You're right. I should have done more. I thought I was holding the family together, but maybe I was just enabling the problems." James scoffed, but some of the tension left his shoulders. "There's something else you need to know," Michael said carefully. "Your mother is sick, James. Terminal cancer." The words hung heavy in the air. James turned away, staring out his apartment window. "I'm not asking you to forgive her," Michael continued. "But maybe we can find some peace, for all of us." James was quiet for a long time before he turned back. "I'll come to a family meeting," he said finally. "But I'm doing it for you and Megan, not for her." Michael nodded, understanding the weight of this small concession. It wasn't forgiveness, but it was a start. The evening sun cast long shadows across Sharon's front lawn as Michael waited anxiously by the door. His heart skipped when he saw Megan's car pull up, followed shortly by James's truck. Both of his children approached slowly, their faces a mix of determination and unease. "Thanks for coming," Michael said softly, pulling the door open. Megan gave him a quick hug while James just nodded, his jaw tight. In the living room, Sharon sat in her favorite armchair, looking smaller than Michael remembered. Her hands trembled slightly as she gripped an old leather photo album. "Megan, James," Sharon's voice cracked. "It's so good to see you both." The silence that followed felt suffocating. Megan perched on the edge of the sofa while James remained standing, arms crossed. "How have you been?" Sharon attempted, her fingers nervously tracing the album's worn edges. "Really?" James scoffed. "That's what you're going with?" Megan shot her brother a look before turning to Sharon. "Mom, you can't just pretend everything's normal. You pushed us away for years, and then we find out about—" She couldn't finish the sentence. "I know," Sharon whispered. "I know I hurt you both. I just—" She struggled to continue, her words falling short. "You just what?" James demanded. "Just decided we weren't worth your time? Just decided to throw away our family?" Michael stepped forward. "James, I understand you're angry, but we're here to try and move forward, not just rehash the past." "Forward?" James laughed bitterly. "Like nothing happened?" "No," Michael said firmly. "Like people who want to heal." Megan wiped at her eyes. "Dad's right, I don't want to carry this anger forever." She looked at Sharon. "But we need more than just 'I'm sorry.'" Sharon nodded, tears spilling down her cheeks. I was so wrapped up in my own unhappiness that I forgot what mattered most." The words came out broken and halting. "I failed you both as a mother." James turned away, staring out the window. Megan's shoulders relaxed slightly, but the pain in her eyes remained. When it became clear Sharon couldn't continue, Michael suggested they take a break. Megan agreed to come back next week, while James merely shrugged before heading for the door. Michael watched as Sharon slumped in her chair, exhaustion etched across her face. He helped her up, supporting her as they made their way to her bedroom, wondering if this fragile attempt at reconciliation would ever truly heal their broken family. Michael sat on the edge of his motel bed early the next morning, his phone pressed to his ear. The emotional weight of last night's family meeting still hung heavy on his shoulders. "Laura, got a minute to talk?" His voice was weary. "Of course, Michael, how did it go?" As he recounted the tense family gathering, Laura listened patiently. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. "Michael," she said gently, "I'm worried about you. You're carrying everyone else's pain but neglecting your own." Her words hit home. "What do you mean?" "You're so focused on fixing things for Sharon and the kids, you're not dealing with your own hurt. When was the last time you took care of yourself?" Michael rubbed his temples, considering her words. The truth was, he'd been pushing aside his own feelings since discovering Sharon's affair. Over the next few days, Michael found himself caught between his growing feelings for Laura and his sense of duty to Sharon. Every time Laura texted, his heart lifted, but guilt quickly followed. He started making excuses to avoid their coffee meetings, letting her messages go unanswered. It wasn't until he literally bumped into her at Miller's Grocery that he couldn't avoid the conversation anymore. "Oh, sorry," he mumbled, nearly dropping his basket when he recognized her. Laura's eyes narrowed. "Are we going to talk about why you've been avoiding me?" Michael glanced around the produce section, uncomfortable. "Laura, No excuses, Michael," she said firmly. "I care about you, but I won't be pushed aside because you're afraid of your feelings. I've been down that road before." "It's complicated," he protested weakly. "Life is complicated," Laura countered. "But I won't be someone's second choice or emotional crutch. I deserve better than that, and so do you." Michael's shoulders slumped. "You're right, I don't know what I want anymore." "Then figure it out," Laura said softly. "But don't string me along while you do." She turned and walked away, leaving Michael standing alone among the vegetables, his heart heavy with indecision. Back in his motel room, Michael sat in the fading daylight, Laura's words echoing in his mind. How could he move forward when he felt so tied to the past? The weight of his choices pressed down on him as darkness crept into the room. Michael pulled into Sharon's driveway, noting how the morning sun cast long shadows across the well-tended garden they'd planted together years ago. With a heavy sigh, he used his key to unlock the front door. "Sharon," he called out, climbing the stairs, "I brought your favorite tea." The silence that greeted him was unusual. Usually she'd call back or at least acknowledge his presence. When he reached her bedroom, he found her still in bed, looking smaller and more fragile than he'd ever seen her. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice thin. "I can't seem to get up today." The sight of her struck him hard. Her skin was pale, almost translucent, and dark circles shadowed her eyes. Her once vibrant auburn hair lay limp against the pillow. Over the next few days, Michael fell into a routine. He'd arrive early, help Sharon with her medication, and prepare simple meals she could manage. Sometimes she'd barely touch the food, but he'd sit with her anyway, sharing quiet moments that reminded him of easier times. One afternoon, as he adjusted her pillows, she made a weak joke about his terrible bedside manner. For a moment, he glimpsed the Sharon he'd known, quick-witted and warm. His chest tightened at the memory. Megan started visiting more regularly, bringing fresh flowers and sitting with her mother while Michael prepared lunch. Sometimes they'd talk about neutral topics, the weather, old family recipes, memories of holiday gatherings. Other times they'd sit in comfortable silence. James's visits were different. He'd arrive, stand awkwardly by the door, and leave after 15 minutes. His discomfort was palpable, his words clipped and formal. Michael tried suggesting they look through old photo albums together or share stories about James's childhood, but his son would shake his head and mutter something about having to get back to work. "He'll come around," Sharon said one evening after James left abruptly. "He's always been the sensitive one." Michael adjusted her blanket, checking that she was comfortable. "I know. I just wish—" He trailed off, unsure how to finish the thought. That night, as Michael helped Sharon settle into bed, he noticed how labored her breathing had become. He adjusted her oxygen tube and smoothed her covers, his movements careful and practiced now. Sitting in the chair beside her bed, watching the rise and fall of her chest, Michael felt the weight of their shared history, the joy, the pain, the betrayal, and now this unexpected role as her caregiver. He wondered if their family could find its way back to each other before time ran out. Michael sat beside Sharon's bed, watching as she fidgeted with her blanket. The morning light filtered through the curtains, casting a soft glow on her pale face. Something in her expression made his stomach tighten. "Michael," she began, her voice barely above a whisper, "I need to tell you something." He nodded, steeling himself. "Go ahead." Sharon's eyes filled with tears. "With Greg, it wasn't just physical. She paused, drawing a shaky breath. "I felt understood in a way I hadn't in years. He listened to my fears, my dreams." Michael's hands clenched in his lap. Each word felt like a knife twisting deeper into his heart. "The truth is," she continued, her voice trembling, "I still care for him. I know that's terrible to admit, especially now, but I need to be honest." She reached for Michael's hand, but he pulled away. "It doesn't mean I don't love you or appreciate everything you've done." "Everything I've done?" Michael cut in, his voice hoarse. "I gave you 35 years of my life, Sharon. I stayed by your side through everything. And now you're telling me that while I was planning our anniversary, you were in love with another man?" Sharon's tears fell freely now. "I know I hurt you. I made horrible choices. But Greg, he saw parts of me that I thought were lost. He made me feel alive when I felt invisible." Michael stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. The room suddenly felt too small, too suffocating. His mind raced back to all the nights he'd stayed up caring for her, all the doctor's appointments he'd arranged, all the times he'd pushed aside his own pain to help her find peace. "Michael, please," Sharon pleaded. "My feelings for Greg don't change how grateful I am for you, how much I—" But Michael couldn't listen anymore. Without a word, he turned and walked out of the room, his footsteps heavy on the wooden floors. In the kitchen, he gripped the counter's edge until his knuckles turned white, fighting back waves of anger and betrayal that threatened to overwhelm him. The kettle on the stove whistled sharply, its piercing sound matching the pain in his chest. He stood there, frozen, as Sharon's words echoed in his mind, each one cutting deeper than the last. Michael tossed and turned in his bed at the motel, finally drifting into an uneasy sleep. In his dreams, he found himself sitting on the familiar wooden bench in his father's workshop, the scent of sawdust thick in the air. His father stood before him, weathered hands resting on his workbench, just as they had countless times during Michael's childhood. "Son," his father's voice was gentle but firm, exactly as Michael remembered it. "You're carrying too much weight on your shoulders." "Dad, you don't understand what she did." His father held up a calloused hand. "Forgiveness isn't about making what happened okay. It's about setting yourself free." The words echoed through Michael's consciousness, stirring something deep within him. His father's kind eyes held his gaze. "You taught others how to escape burning buildings, but you're trapped in one of your own making, son. The anger, the hurt, they're the smoke filling your lungs." Michael jerked awake at 4 a.m., his father's words still ringing in his ears. He sat up, rubbing his face, and stared out the window at the pre-dawn darkness. The dream felt more real than any he'd had in years. Getting dressed quietly, he drove to Sharon's house and parked outside. As the sun began to rise, painting the sky in soft pinks and oranges, Michael thought about his father's wisdom. The anger he'd been carrying felt heavy in his chest, like a weight pressing down on him. "Maybe it's not about understanding why," he whispered to himself. "Maybe it's just about letting go." When he entered the house later that morning, he moved through his caregiving duties with a quiet determination. He prepared Sharon's medication, helped her with breakfast, and adjusted her pillows, all without mentioning their conversation from the day before. As morning turned to afternoon, Michael sat beside Sharon's bed while she slept. Her hand lay small and fragile on the blanket. After a moment's hesitation, he took it in his own. "I forgive you," he whispered. The words meant only for himself. They felt both foreign and familiar on his tongue, like the first breath after being underwater too long. The morning sun filtered through Sharon's bedroom window as Michael helped her into a comfortable position on the living room couch. Her hands trembled slightly as she smoothed her sweater, betraying her nervousness about the upcoming visit. "They're really coming?" Sharon's voice quavered. "Both of them?" Michael nodded, adjusting a pillow behind her back. Megan agreed right away. James took some convincing, but he's coming too. The doorbell rang at exactly noon. Michael opened the door to find Megan and James standing side by side, an awkward distance between them. Megan carried a small bouquet of flowers, while James's hands were shoved deep in his pockets. "Hi, Dad," Megan said softly, giving him a quick hug. James merely nodded. When they entered the living room, Sharon's face lit up despite her exhaustion. "My babies," she whispered, tears already forming in her eyes. After they settled into chairs, Sharon took a deep breath. "I need to say something," she began, her voice stronger than it had been in days. "I failed you both in so many ways. I was selfish and distant when you needed me most. The choices I made—" She paused, wiping her eyes. "They hurt all of you. And I'm so deeply sorry." Megan's lower lip trembled as she reached for her mother's hand. "Mom," she managed, tears spilling down her cheeks. James remained still, his jaw tight, but Michael noticed his son's hands gripping the armrests of his chair. "Remember that camping trip?" Sharon asked suddenly, her voice brightening. "When James got scared by that raccoon?" Despite himself, James's lips twitched. "It was huge," he protested. "And it was dark." "You screamed so loud you woke up the entire campground," Megan chuckled, wiping her eyes. "And your father," Sharon continued, smiling at Michael, "tried to chase it away with a flashlight and tripped over the tent rope." The memory sparked more stories. Megan's disastrous first attempt at baking cookies, James's championship Little League game, family road trips where they sang off-key to old radio hits. For a precious hour, laughter mixed with tears as they remembered happier times. When the visit drew to a close, Sharon reached for both her children's hands. "Thank you," she said simply, her voice thick with emotion. "Thank you for coming." Megan leaned down to hug her mother, holding on longer than usual. James hesitated before giving Sharon a brief, stiff embrace. Michael walked them to the door, watching as they headed to their cars. Through the window, he saw Megan wave goodbye, while James paused for a moment before driving away. The afternoon had brought no miraculous transformation, but perhaps it was a start. Michael watched the autumn leaves dance outside Sharon's bedroom window as he adjusted her pillows for the third time that morning. Her breathing had become more labored over the past few days, and her once vibrant face now held a ghostly pallor. "Are you comfortable?" he asked softly, helping her take small sips of water. Sharon managed a weak nod. "Thank you, Michael. I know this isn't easy." The days had fallen into a demanding routine. Every 4 hours, Michael carefully measured out Sharon's medications, marking each dose in a detailed log. Between treatments, he prepared light meals she could barely touch, helped her to the bathroom, and changed her sheets when needed. During one particularly difficult afternoon, while helping Sharon sit up to eat some soup, Michael caught a glimpse of their reflection in the dresser mirror. The sight gave him pause, him supporting her fragile frame, her head resting against his shoulder. It was an intimate moment that stirred complicated emotions he wasn't ready to face. Megan started coming by more regularly, usually in the afternoons. She'd taken to reading to Sharon or helping with simple tasks like combing her mother's thinning hair. Michael noticed how Sharon's eyes would light up at these small gestures, though neither woman seemed ready to address the deeper wounds between them. "Dad, why don't you take a break?" Megan suggested one day. "I can handle Mom's evening medication." But James's visits remained brief and tense. He would stand in the doorway, exchange a few pleasantries, and leave within minutes. After one such visit, Michael followed him out to his car. "Son, wait!" Michael called out. "Can we talk?" James turned, his jaw tight. "About what, Dad? How we're all supposed to pretend everything's fine now?" "Nobody's pretending anything," Michael said, trying to keep his voice steady. "But she's still your mother." "I'm here because you asked me to be," James replied, opening his car door. "That's all I can give right now." That night, Michael sat in the familiar chair beside Sharon's bed, listening to the quiet rhythm of her breathing. The bedside lamp cast soft shadows across the room as he watched her sleep, his mind heavy with thoughts of their shared past and uncertain future. His hands ached from the day's tasks, but it was the weight in his chest that felt heaviest. The evening sun cast long shadows across Sharon's bedroom as Michael heard her calling his name. He found her propped up against her pillows, a weathered leather photo album open on her lap. "Look at this one," she said, her thin finger trembling as she pointed to a photograph. "Our wedding day. Remember how nervous you were?" Michael sat on the edge of the bed, leaning in to see the image. There they were, young and beaming, him in his tuxedo and Sharon radiant in white lace. "I wasn't nervous," he protested softly, "just excited." They turned the pages slowly, each photograph sparking memories. A family trip to the beach when Megan was 5 and James just a toddler. Christmas mornings with wrapping paper strewn across the floor. Birthday parties and graduations. "I was so proud of you," Sharon said quietly, her voice catching. "Everyone respected you so much. The brave firefighter, the community hero." She paused, her hands shaking slightly as she smoothed a wrinkled page. Sometimes I felt like I wasn't enough, like I couldn't measure up to how others saw you." Michael felt his chest tighten as Sharon continued, her words coming out in a whisper. "With Greg, it was different. He made me feel important, special." She looked up at Michael, tears welling in her eyes. "But it was all wrong. I was looking for something I already had, only I couldn't see it." Michael sat in silence, processing her words. The hurt was still there, but somehow different now. After a long moment, he spoke. "Sharon, whatever mistakes we both made, they don't erase the life we built together. These photos, these memories, they're real, they matter." Sharon reached for his hand, her grip weak but determined. "Thank you for staying with me now, even after everything. I don't deserve it." Don't talk about deserve, Michael said gently. We're past that now. They continued looking through the album until Sharon's eyes grew heavy. As she drifted off to sleep, Michael carefully closed the book and placed it on the bedside table. He remained seated beside her, listening to her breathing, surrounded by the memories they'd just revisited. The morning sun filtered through the motel window as Michael's phone buzzed. Laura's name lit up the screen. He answered, hearing the warmth in her voice. "How are you holding up?" she asked. "Managing," Michael replied, rubbing his tired eyes. "Let me take you to lunch. You need a break, even if it's just for an hour." Michael glanced at his watch, considering Sharon's medication schedule. "I suppose I could spare an hour." They met at a quiet diner off Main Street. Laura had already claimed a corner booth, and Michael slid in across from her. She studied his face, noting the dark circles under his eyes and the slump in his shoulders. "You look exhausted," she said softly. Michael managed a weak smile. "It's been challenging." Laura reached across the table, her hand stopping short of touching his. "I'm worried about you, Michael. You're pouring everything into caring for Sharon, but what about you?" "I'm fine," he insisted, but his voice lacked conviction. "Remember when I told you about Tom's addiction?" Laura's eyes grew distant. "I was so focused on saving him that I nearly destroyed myself in the process. Sometimes our sense of duty can become a prison." Michael stirred his coffee absently. "This is different. Sharon's dying, Laura. Our children need this time with her. I need to make sure they have that chance." "I understand that," Laura said gently, "but you can't pour from an empty cup. You need to take care of yourself too." "What would you have me do?" Michael asked, a hint of defensiveness creeping into his voice. "Walk away? After 25 years? Laura shook her head. "No, that's not what I'm saying. But you need balance. You need to remember that your life doesn't stop because Sharon's is ending." Michael sat back, considering her words. "I made a commitment, not just to Sharon, but to our family. This isn't about forgiveness anymore. It's about giving our children the closure they deserve." "I respect that," Laura said softly. "Just promise me you won't lose yourself in the process." Their eyes met across the table, understanding passing between them. Michael nodded slowly, acknowledging her concern, even if he couldn't fully embrace her advice. As they finished their lunch, the tension eased but didn't completely dissipate. Laura's words had struck a chord, even if Michael wasn't ready to act on them. When they parted outside the diner, Michael felt the weight of conflicting emotions. He appreciated Laura's concern, but his path seemed set. He would see this through, whatever the cost to himself. Sharon lay propped up against her pillows, her face pale but determined. She had asked Michael to call the children, and now they sat beside her bed. Megan perched nervously on a chair, James standing with his arms crossed near the doorway. "I need to say something," Sharon began, her voice barely above a whisper. Michael stood quietly in the corner, watching as she gathered her strength. She turned first to Megan, her eyes filling with tears. "Sweetheart, I've been such a poor mother to you. All those times you needed me, your graduations, your breakups, your achievements. I was so wrapped up in my own world that I missed being there for you. I'm so sorry for all the pain I caused." Megan's lower lip trembled as she listened. Tears began rolling down her cheeks. "Mom, she started, then had to take a deep breath. "It hurt so much feeling like I wasn't important enough. Like nothing I did mattered." "You mattered. You always mattered," Sharon insisted weakly. "I was the one who failed you, not the other way around." Megan reached for her mother's hand, squeezing it gently. "It will take time," she said softly. "But I want to forgive you. I do." Sharon nodded gratefully before turning her attention to James. Her son's face remained impassive as she struggled to find the words. "James," she began, "I know I've hurt you too deeply to ask for forgiveness. I won't insult you by trying. All I ask is that when you think of me, try to remember the good times too, reading you bedtime stories, teaching you to ride your bike. She paused, catching her breath. And please don't let the anger poison your life. Let it go. Not for me, but for yourself. James stood silently for a long moment, his jaw working. Finally, he gave a slight nod. "I'll try," he said quietly. Michael watched from his corner, his heart aching with pride at Sharon's courage and hope for their family's healing. The room felt lighter somehow, as if a heavy weight had begun to lift. As Megan and James prepared to leave, Sharon turned to Michael with the faintest smile. "Thank you," she whispered, "for making this possible." Michael stepped forward and gently squeezed her hand in response, feeling a small measure of peace settle over them both. Michael entered Sharon's room early that morning, carrying a cup of tea that would likely go untouched. The sunlight filtering through the curtains cast a soft glow on her frail form. Her eyes, though tired, held a certain urgency as she reached for his hand. "Michael, please stay," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "There's something I need to tell you." He settled into the chair beside her bed, noting how the illness had hollowed her cheeks and dimmed her once vibrant presence. Sharon took a shaky breath, gathering her strength. "I've been thinking about us, about everything," she began, her fingers trembling in his. "The affair, I thought I needed validation, someone to make me feel special, but I was so wrong." Tears welled in her eyes. "You were always my anchor, Michael. Even when I felt lost, your kindness, your steadiness, it kept me going." Michael listened silently, his heart tightening in his chest. Sharon continued, her words coming slowly but deliberately. "The way you loved me, it was constant, unwavering. I didn't deserve it. I took your goodness for granted, and I'll regret that for the rest of my days." She paused, struggling to catch her breath. "I'm so sorry, Michael. Not just for the affair, but for not seeing what was right in front of me all along." Michael felt tears threatening to fall as he watched his wife's face, lined with genuine remorse and love. He took a deep breath, processing her words. "Sharon," he said gently, "I may never fully understand why things happened the way they did, but sitting here now, I choose to remember the joy we shared, the family we built, rather than dwell on the pain." She smiled weakly, relief washing over her features. Her grip on his hand softened as exhaustion began to overtake her. "Thank you," she murmured as her eyes fluttered closed. "Thank you for everything." Michael watched as she drifted off to sleep, their joined hands a bridge between past hurts and present forgiveness. He sat in the quiet room, reflecting on their journey, from young love to betrayal, and finally to this moment of bittersweet peace. The evening light cast long shadows across Sharon's bedroom as she gestured weakly toward her bedside table. "Michael," she whispered, "there's something I need you to do." Michael moved closer, his weathered hand steady as he opened the drawer. Sharon directed him to a plain white envelope, sealed and unmarked. "This is for you," she said, her voice thin but determined. "But promise me you won't read it until after I'm gone." She pressed the envelope into his hands, her touch fragile as tissue paper. Michael nodded, unable to speak past the lump in his throat. He carefully tucked the letter into his shirt pocket, close to his heart. "Thank you," Sharon continued, "for staying, for helping our children find their way back to me." Her eyes glistened with unshed tears. "But Michael, I need you to promise me something else." He leaned in closer to hear her barely audible words. "Promise me you'll find happiness again," she said. "You deserve love and peace in your life. Don't let my mistakes keep you from that." Michael's voice cracked as he replied, "Sharon, Please," she interrupted. "Promise me you'll try." "I promise," he whispered, squeezing her hand gently. Later that evening, Megan and James arrived. Their footsteps were quiet as they entered the room, but their presence filled the space with warmth. Michael watched as they settled on either side of Sharon's bed, their faces soft with emotion. "Remember that summer at the lake house?" Megan asked, her voice thick with tears and laughter. "When James tried to teach me to fish?" James chuckled. "And you ended up hooking Dad's favorite hat instead." Sharon smiled weakly. "Your father was so proud of you both, even with his hat at the bottom of the lake." Michael stepped back, watching his family share memories and gentle laughter. He slipped quietly from the room, giving them privacy for these precious moments. In the hallway, he leaned against the wall, overwhelmed by the bittersweet scene. Their family, broken and healing, had found their way back to each other just in time. When he returned later that night, Sharon had fallen into a peaceful sleep. Michael took his familiar place in the chair beside her bed, watching the gentle rise and fall of her chest. Tears rolled freely down his cheeks as he whispered, "You're finally at peace." The morning sunlight filtered through the curtains, casting a soft glow across Sharon's bedroom. Michael stirred in the chair where he'd spent the night, his neck stiff from the awkward position. As consciousness fully returned, he immediately sensed something was different. The room held an unfamiliar stillness. Looking at Sharon, he knew. Her face was peaceful, almost serene, as if she had simply drifted off into a gentle sleep. Michael reached for her hand. It was cold. His breath caught in his throat as the reality sank in. With trembling fingers, he pulled out his phone and called Megan first. His voice was steady despite the tears threatening to fall. "Sweetheart, it's Dad. Mom, she's gone." He heard Megan's sharp intake of breath followed by quiet sobs. "I'll be right there," she managed to say. James answered on the first ring. The conversation was brief, his son's voice tight with emotion. "I'm on my way," was all he said. Within the hour, both children arrived. They gathered around Sharon's bedside, forming a small circle of shared grief. Megan's tears fell freely as she held her mother's hand one last time. James stood rigid, his jaw clenched, but his eyes betrayed his pain. "Your mother would have been so proud," Michael said softly, placing a hand on each of their shoulders. These past few weeks meant everything to her. Later that morning, Michael began the difficult task of making arrangements. He sat at the kitchen table with a notepad, listing people to contact and details to handle. The funeral home, the church, family members. Each item he wrote felt like another weight on his shoulders. As evening approached and the house grew quiet, Michael found himself alone in the living room. The sealed letter Sharon had given him sat on the coffee table, untouched. He stared at it, his heart heavy with emotion. Not yet, he thought, pushing it aside. He wasn't ready to read her final words. The church was quiet except for the soft rustling of clothes as people found their seats. Morning light streamed through stained glass windows, casting colorful patterns across the wooden pews. Michael stood at the podium, his eulogy notes trembling slightly in his hands. He took a deep breath, looking out at the gathered faces, some familiar, some barely remembered. "Sharon wasn't perfect," he began, his voice steady despite his nerves. "None of us are. But she had a strength that showed itself most clearly at the end, the courage to face her mistakes and try to make things right." He paused, glancing at Megan and James in the front row. "In our 30 years together, Sharon gave us countless moments of joy. She had a laugh that could light up a room. She made every holiday special for our children. And in her final days, she showed us that it's never too late to choose love over pride." Michael's voice grew softer as he continued. "Her greatest gift to us wasn't the years we shared, but this family we built together. Even when things were difficult, that foundation remained. And in her final weeks, she brought us together again, reminding us that forgiveness is possible." After the service, mourners filed past, offering quiet condolences. Megan approached Michael first, wrapping her arms around him in a tight embrace. "Thank you, Dad," she whispered, her voice thick with tears. "For everything." James stood awkwardly for a moment before stepping forward. His thank you was quiet but sincere, carrying the weight of months of emotional struggle. As people began to leave, Michael noticed Laura standing near the back of the church. She caught his eye and offered a gentle, encouraging smile, a reminder that he wasn't alone. Michael nodded in acknowledgement, feeling a small measure of comfort in her presence. The sunlight continued to paint the church in soft colors as the last mourners departed, leaving Michael with a mixture of grief and peace. Michael's hands shook slightly as he held the sealed envelope. The motel room felt unusually still, with only the steady tick-tock of the wall clock breaking the silence. Afternoon sunlight filtered through thin curtains, casting long shadows across the worn carpet. He traced Sharon's familiar handwriting on the envelope with his finger. After a deep breath, he carefully broke the seal and unfolded the pages inside. Sharon's normally neat penmanship appeared shaky, revealing her weakened state when she wrote it. "Dear Michael," the letter began, "if you're reading this, I'm already gone. There's so much I need to say, things I couldn't find the strength to tell you face to face." Michael shifted in his chair, his heart heavy as he continued reading. Sharon wrote about their early years together, the joy they shared, and how his unwavering dedication had been the foundation of their family. Her words were raw and honest as she acknowledged the pain she'd caused. "You stayed by my side even when I gave you every reason to walk away," she wrote. "Your strength and compassion showed me what true love really means. I didn't deserve your forgiveness, but you gave it anyway." Tears blurred Michael's vision as he read Sharon's deepest regret, taking him for granted during their marriage. She described how his steady presence had been her anchor, even during the times she'd pushed him away. "My biggest mistake wasn't just the affair," she continued. "It was not appreciating the wonderful man who stood beside me all those years. You deserved so much better, Michael." The final paragraph spoke of her hopes for his future. "Please don't close your heart," she wrote. "You have so much love to give. Find happiness again, Michael. That's my final wish for you." As Michael finished reading, he felt something shift inside him, a mixture of profound sadness and unexpected peace. Their marriage hadn't been perfect, but there had been real love there, moments worth remembering and cherishing. With gentle care, he folded the letter and slipped it back into its envelope. Setting it on the bedside table, he walked to the window. Outside, the first rays of dawn were breaking across the horizon, painting the sky in soft pinks and purples. "Thank you, Sharon," he whispered to the quiet room. Michael woke to sunlight streaming through the motel window. For the first time since Sharon's passing, his chest didn't feel quite so heavy. He reached for his phone on the nightstand, scrolling through his contacts until Laura's name appeared on the screen. His thumb hovered over her number as memories of their conversations flooded back. Her kindness, her understanding, her steady presence through it all. After taking a deep breath, he pressed call. The phone rang 3 times before Laura's warm voice answered. "Michael?" "Hi, Laura," he said softly. "I was wondering if you'd like to meet for lunch today, at our usual place?" A brief pause followed before she replied, "I'd like that." They met at the small cafe where they'd shared so many important conversations over the past months. Laura sat across from him, her hands wrapped around a coffee mug, waiting patiently as Michael gathered his thoughts. "I'm sorry I pulled away," he finally said, meeting her eyes. "When Sharon was... At the end, I couldn't handle letting anyone else in. Even you. Especially you." Laura nodded, her expression gentle but guarded. "I understand, Michael. I really do. You've been incredible through all of this," Michael continued. "Your support meant everything, even when I wasn't showing it. I'd like to start fresh if you're willing." Laura set her mug down carefully, considering his words. "I care about you, Michael, but I need to know that you're ready for a real relationship, one where we're both fully present." "I want that too," Michael replied earnestly. "I know it won't be easy, but I'd like to try, one step at a time." They ordered lunch, and the conversation flowed more naturally. They talked about Laura's son Jacob's upcoming baseball game, Michael's plans to eventually sell his house, and their shared hope for the future. The weight of recent events still lingered, but it felt less overwhelming in Laura's presence. As they prepared to leave, Laura reached across the table and gently touched Michael's arm. "Take it one day at a time," she said softly. Michael smiled, a genuine smile that reached his eyes for the first time in what felt like forever, and nodded. A month had passed, and Michael found himself settling into a comfortable routine with Laura. They met regularly for coffee, shared quiet evenings watching movies, and even included Jacob in some of their outings. The connection between them grew stronger each day, built on understanding and mutual respect. One evening, over dinner at Laura's favorite Italian restaurant, Michael noticed something was different. Laura seemed distracted, pushing her pasta around her plate more than eating it. Finally, she set down her fork and looked up at him. "I received a job offer yesterday," she said softly. "It's in Colorado. The position would mean better opportunities for Jacob's education and a significant increase in pay." Michael's heart sank, but he maintained a supportive smile. "Tell me more about it." Laura explained the details. A senior nursing position at a prestigious hospital, excellent benefits, and most importantly, access to one of the best school districts in the state for Jacob. As she spoke, her eyes lit up with excitement, though her voice carried an undercurrent of sadness. "It sounds perfect for you and Jacob," Michael said, reaching across the table to squeeze her hand. "You should take it." Laura's eyes welled with tears. "But what about us?" "Sometimes the right thing isn't the easy thing," Michael replied, his voice gentle but firm. "Jacob's future has to come first. We both know that." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, acknowledging the bittersweet truth of their situation. Laura wiped her eyes with her napkin and gave him a wobbly smile. "You're an incredible man, Michael Carter," she said. "These past months, you've helped me remember what it feels like to open my heart again." "And you've helped me heal," Michael responded. "We'll stay in touch. Who knows what the future holds?" That evening, Michael stood on his porch watching Laura's taillights disappear into the darkness. He twisted his wedding ring, a familiar gesture he'd maintained even after Sharon's passing. With careful deliberation, he slipped it off and placed it on the windowsill. The setting sun painted the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks, and Michael felt an unexpected sense of peace wash over him. He was ready for whatever came next. If you enjoyed the story of Jonathan, I hand-picked this next story that you will enjoy, Kausar. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.